Welcome back to chapter 27. This is part 2. At the end of part 1, we left off with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, it has 3 names. The Cubans call it the October Crisis, we call it the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Russians call it the Caribbean Crisis. 3 very important components in this mix that's going to bring about the United States and Russia being nose to nose at nuclear all-out nightmare in October of 1862. Now, we had learned about the nuclear machinery and the weapons there in a flyover in October of 14th of that month. Now, we announced that the Russians were not allowed to have those nasties that close to our house. And in fact, Kennedy will order the Russians to dismantle them. And of course, their leader, who's Nikita Khrushchev, came back and said, no, we're not going to do that. So Kennedy further ordered a quarantine around the island of Cuba. Nobody coming in, nobody going out. And ultimately, this quarantine is going to be what brings us to that very edge, because Russian ships are inbound. As those Russian ships encounter the United States ships as we quarantine around the island, this is where it gets a little tricky. The Russian ships want to know, what are we going to do? And the American ships are just standing their ground. Ultimately, Khrushchev craters. He tells his own people to turn around and come home, forcing the Russian resistance and the Cuban resistance to fall apart. The United States comes out shining. Kennedy said, thank you, we don't want war, we just want that stuff gone. Now, they will have to have a in-depth conversation to finalize in ending this conflict, because it's not a war, it's a conflict. So the deal was here made. Publicly, everybody could see, there'd be photographs, that the Russians would dismantle all of their weapons and take them home, that the United Nations would come in afterward and inspect Cuba, and that we personally had to agree never to attack Cuba, and we also had to do something else. While we had been in this Cold War against Russia, we had been building some things of our own in Turkey. We'd actually built some nuclear materials and silos in Turkey to kind of give us a little edge or protection zone, if you will, against Russia and the nuclear attack. Russia knew about these things. So their demands for us to agree is we had to dismantle ours that we had built in Turkey. So we said, okay, we can do that. They also established a connection or a hotline, so to speak, where White House and Washington would be able to talk to Moscow at any time if there is an elevated element, this catastrophe that could be happening again. So that is a good thing that came from that. The end of the crisis happens 2 weeks after that. Russia totally comes in and dismantles and takes everything away. We end our quarantine on November 20th, 1962, and we had also gotten rid of all of our Turkish weapons by the next year, 1963. So we're going to see that we can get to the edge if we're not careful, and we need to be very, very careful and make sure that we practice very good diplomacy between those 2 entities. Because ultimately, they have roughly the same number of nuclear warheads in stash that we do. So again, it's that mad, mutually assured destruction if one of us should decide to hit some buttons. So in October of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. has led this movement to Washington. It's called For Jobs and Freedom. And ultimately, now 250,000 people are there. And he gives that speech, this very, very famous speech. And, you know, John F. Kennedy supported civil rights. He did. He was a guy who believed that equality was something to fight for. And so Kennedy was on board with being sure that certain civil rights laws and actions were passed. So he will help put together some of those civil rights laws that his predecessor, his followers will actually make them happen. Unfortunately, Kennedy is going to be assassinated in November of 1963 in Dallas, Texas, in a place called Dealey Plaza. An individual who is named Lee Harvey Oswald is believed to be the lone gunman to have shot Kennedy in the head as he was in an open-top car in a parade down the middle of Dallas, Texas. Kennedy will die en route to the hospital, and then his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, will assume the presidency. And Lyndon B. Johnson is also a guy who supports civil rights. So he's going to push through a lot of those conversations and topics that Kennedy started with Congress. One is, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Johnson had a program called the Great Society. His main thing was he wanted to help people. Johnson started his entire career as a teacher in very South Texas. His students were very poor whites and migrant children. And so he visualized and he saw firsthand how kids who were hungry, kids who are migratory, and kids who have really no anchor, it hurts them educationally. So with his ability now to kind of shape domestic policy, he came up with the Great Society. Great Society was programs designed to help the poor people in this country. Ultimately, he had two goals with Great Society. One is to end racial injustice, and two, eliminate poverty. Very high goals, very hard to achieve. Mostly not done. But he will push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which will outlaw discrimination, racial, ethnic, national, or religious minorities in women, to help those folks in educational facilities and work sites to become more opportunities available for them. Now, on the foreign policy for Johnson, it was a little shady there. Because when Johnson comes in, he's got his plate full. He's got one hand, he's got the civil rights thing going on, and the poor people. And then on the other, he has the Vietnam War, because this has been happening since 1954. But Johnson is going to, at this point, he's going to push all his chips in, and he's going to go full-on scale war, no doubt. It's not a declared war, never was, but ultimately, because of something that happens in a place called the Gulf of Tonkin, which is just off the coast of Vietnam, Johnson asked Congress for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which basically they give him a blank check to handle the war as best as he sees fit. And because of this thing that goes on in the Gulf of Tonkin, 2 American battleships are on patrol, and we're not at war, so they're just there watching. A couple of shots are fired, and they are reported to be attacking the American ships, which wasn't happening. It was actually a couple of fish trawlers. But Johnson did not know that, and he goes to Congress, asks for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and they give it to him. Anything that you need to do to protect American boys, you do it. So he has a blank check. He has unlimited power. Johnson will use this unlimited power to full-scale invade Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and we, within hours, have our first POW. Our first POW, and he is going to be kept for the duration of the war. Alfred Everest is his name. And we're going to have, of course, many, many more over the course of the next few years. But while he's fighting the war against Vietnam, he's also fighting the war on poverty here at home. And he's going to have $3 billion that he will spend over the course of 3 years to fight this war on poverty. He gets reelected in 1964. And with his reelection and his war on poverty, Johnson finds himself a very outstretched man. His resources are so stretched thin. He is going to be so stressed out, so all over the place, that after this, he will not seek re-election again after this term that he wins. 1965, we see some more racial issues going on. Malcolm X, who was for Malcolm Little, is shot in 1965 by 3 of his own team members, leading to riots across the country and a lot of more turmoil and trouble and problems that we just weren't prepared for. 1968 is a double whammy. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is killed in Memphis, Tennessee, at the hotel that he is staying at, and shot by a man whose name is James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray was an ex-con, who was a racist, who was simply at the right spot at the wrong time. And James Earl Ray will kill Martin Luther King. That year, 1965, also finally passed the Voting Rights Act, which disavows any literacy test or any kind of discrimination in voting. No state can impose qualifications that prohibit or keep people from voting. And then in 65, we also have the event known as Bloody Sunday. It is Selma, Alabama. It is March the 7th. And as protesters are crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in their march toward Montgomery, which is the capital, they are stopped, they are beaten, some are killed. This is why it's called Bloody Sunday. Ultimately, President Johnson will order that they be allowed to march from Selma to Montgomery, and that he will send national troops to protect them. And he does that in his march. The Voting Rights Act is passed. We see also in 1968, Bobby Kennedy, JFK's little brother, is also assassinated. He is at a speech. Bobby Kennedy was running for president in 68, and Bobby Kennedy is shot by a man whose name is Sirhan Sirhan. He was a Palestinian who apparently his motive was that we were supporting Israel and that's their natural enemy. So that was his thought, was he needed to make himself and his viewpoint known. There we have it. That ends chapter 27. See you next time.